Hi. So, how are you guys doing? Hopefully good. Obviously, you can't reply, so maybe that was a bad question to ask. But as you can see, little new space. Hopefully, you guys are doing better now that you see such a beautiful background and the sexy face, as always. But I digress. What are we talking about today? Well, we're talking about this quote I love by Martin Luther King, where he says, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I think it has important implications not only for how we view our world, but for how we view ourselves and our own lives. And I think there's something you can take away which isn't, fluffy. It's not like, oh, no, everything will get better. I don't care about that. That doesn't matter to me. Something real, something tangible, which matters to you and which can hopefully um, help you in even just a small way. Right? That's always my goal. So, first, I think it's important to understand what is he even talking about directly and literally in that moment, right? Who is he talking to? Well, he's talking to a crowd of freedom riders, as they were called, in front of the Alabama State House in 1965, as the Freedom Rider name suggests. They were taking a ride for freedom. They were uh, leading a group of African Americans to register for the right to vote, and it's helping to inspire and help more African Americans in Alabama to register. They were broadly successful in that moment, but that doesn't go to the question. What does he mean by the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice? This is such a, high and mighty fluffy term. It's not real, right? It's not actually something we can grab. But I want to try to make it so for us, so we kind of understand the context. So these people who are taking this ride for freedom, rather, they have lived their life being second class citizens, right? They've lived their life as less than everyone around them. Imagine growing up in a world where you're treated different than the person standing next to you, the person you feel is your equal, you believe with every fiber of your being is equal, simply for an immutable characteristic you have no control over, and which does not affect the content of your character or your actions, right? It doesn't make you a less honorable, a less kind, a less generous, a less good person. It doesn't change who you are. Something outside of your control, purely superficial, right? These people grew up in that world and now face the fire hoses, right? Sort of reminds me, I don't mean to get too biblical, I think it's irrelevant whether you're religious or not, but it reminds me of the Jews as they were liberated out of Egypt in the desert. They kept saying to Moses, "Why have you taken us from uh, the land of Egypt and brought us to this suffering?" Right? Not to say that African Americans at that time facing these um, problems and those people fighting for civil rights weren't um, doing something honorable or good, right? Not to say that they were weak or anything. I certainly believe quite the contrary. But you must realize they grew up in a world which is terrible and difficult and hard. And now they are facing physical violence. They're facing even worse discrimination because of their trying to protest for the right, for rights rather, right? And so what Martin Luther King is asking them is to sort of deny something which we, as human beings, intrinsically have in us, and it is this sort of view of the world only as today, only as the last year. When you think of yourself, you don't think of, or rather, if you think of how you're doing, you don't think of how you're doing in the context of your life. You think of how you're doing right now. And that's genetically programmed into us. And it makes sense why it's programmed into us. Because a Neanderthal, you know, is trying to find food. Well, it doesn't matter how he felt for the rest of his life before this. All that matters is how he feels right now. And right now, he's hungry, so he's got to get some food. Right? That's the thing that matters. And it's not a bad instinct by any means. It's what drives us, it helps us succeed. But often it can lead to this unintended consequence, whether, you know, biology and evolution doesn't really have intended consequences or unintended consequences. Well, not really, but what I'm getting at is it has the unintended consequence of leading us to this feeling that the whole world is right now. If that makes sense, that we look at our lives as just this moment, without the context of where we have been. We only see it as the suffering of today, not the greater suffering of yesterday. Not the we don't see the improvement. We only see the terrible part of today. And again, it makes sense, but it does have this unintended consequence of us not feeling that things can get better because we're terrible now. And so again, what Martin Luther King is asking these people is to step back, step out of themselves, and see that arc. See the universe. See the history of their people, right? Their ancestors, their grandfathers, their great-grandparents, fathers, right? Their great-grandparents had far less rights, far less choice, far less freedom than them. And they sacrificed so their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren could have a better life. They worked to the bone to create that better life. And they succeeded broadly, right? And those people in Birmingham, Alabama in 1965 were doing the same thing. And what he's showing them is that there's a brighter day ahead. That they're doing this for a reason. That although I don't see the change today, although the world hasn't shifted on its axis today, we're marching towards that massive change. And I think when we put this in the context of our own world, as in our modern world, often we see our lives and our world as one which is sort of terrible. We're filled with the anxieties, the fears, the problems of today. And I think as a consequence of many postmodern thinkers, when we look back at the history of the universe, right? Well, of man at least, human being, man, human being. We think of it as one marred and characterized by suffering, pain, exploitation, slavery, war, famine, drought, these horrible things. Yet, I think that is characterizing the history of our world by looking into specific moments and saying, look, these wars were terrible. All wars must be terrible. There's wars throughout history, so history must be terrible. Right? We do this kind of syllogistic thinking. We see drought. We see drought leads to death. Death is terrible. Death is so bad for us. People die. It's not good, right? We don't want that. Drought has been throughout history. People have died throughout history. History is terrible. Right? All these moments are terrible. People were so terrible back then. I don't mean to keep belaboring the point, but I think if we actually look back and we take what Martin Luther King says, a broad view, a panoramic view of history, we'll see one which includes these terrible things: drought, famine, slavery, wars, death. And yet we'll see one also of unimaginable sacrifice. We'll see a continual step towards something better, continual steps towards something better, right? Each generation thought that they could see a better world and fought to make a better world a reality for their children and for their children's children. Right? That is the sacrifice of history. That these people have died so you and I can live. So I can be in this room relaxing, in front of a camera and choose to do what I'm doing today. Choose to spend my money on this, this light. I get to choose to do that because of the sacrifice of those throughout history. When we take that broad panoramic view, suddenly it doesn't become so depressing, right? It's not depressing. Not everybody in history is terrible. In fact, quite the contrary, at least in my view. The broad, vast majority of people throughout history have been amazing, kind, and sacrificial people. People who have sacrificed themselves so that their children can have that better life. See, that's what characterizes our history. Martin Luther King says in another speech, in fact, my favorite speech, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." He says, "I have been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land." He says, I don't know if I'll get there with you, but I know that we as a people will get there. I think in that moment he's not asking us to look back, but look forward. To see the arc of the universe as one which has guided and has bent towards justice, towards right. And he's saying, look in the future. We must continue to take these steps, and we will reach this promised land, right? The milk and honey, the life we all desire, the world free of this suffering. And we will reach it. He says, but I don't know if I'll reach it with you. Because that's what each generation has realized. I don't know if I'm going to get there. In fact, I know I probably won't. But I know that we, as a people, will get there, right? We, as a people, as humanity, will reach the promised land, right? I was going to talk more about this, but I think it's important to talk about what it means for us individually. What does this idea mean for me? For my own life, for my own improvement? Well, I was talking to somebody recently, and it reminded me often we look at our own lives only through the suffering of today, as the problems of today, the hardships of today. But we don't recognize the arc of our lives. We don't recognize the progression. And even when we do, it's like, oh yeah, sure, I've gotten better, but it's terrible for me now. But then we need to remember, this other speech Martin Luther King says, where he says, I've seen the promised land. You need to look forward. Tomorrow is always brighter than today for you. However terrible it might seem tomorrow, as long as you're trying to take steps towards the better future, you're becoming a part of this march of generations towards this better future, then tomorrow is always going to be better, right? Then generations later, you will have created a better life for your children, for those you care about. I think we get caught up in what's happening today to me, right? I get caught up in the people who don't like me today, the people who get upset with me today, the problems of today, the failings of myself today. And often I get trapped as a person I once was. As a child, as a teen, as an adult. I get trapped as if the world is the same as it once was. For those of us who, well, for many people, right, who grew up in difficult situations, and you fight out of that. Often it feels like I'm still there. Still see the world the same way. But you need to take that second, take that moment to realize, no, I'm not there. If we can remove ourselves, if we can step back, we can realize, no, I'm being guided towards something better. I realize this might just sound like I'm saying, it'll all get better. Everything will just get better. Don't worry, everything will get better. That's a lot like people who are like, well, people who are Christian or who are religious. I think anybody who's religious, right? That's a common criticism. Like, well, anybody religious is so easy. Because it's all part of God's plan. Or, it's all part of, the flow of the universe, the Tao or something like that, right? You all know it's all just, supposed to happen. I think that's an unfair critique, or maybe an unfounded critique, rather. In the fact that doesn't mean I'm not suffering today. It doesn't mean I'm not having to face the fire hoses today. It doesn't mean my flesh isn't being bitten into by dogs today. It simply means I know I'm part of something larger. Something far more important than my own life. Something far more important than my own suffering today or my own triumph today. I'm part of a march towards this infinite good which I cannot even grasp. Towards a world free from the struggles and pains which characterize my life, the suffering which characterizes my life. And so, to be a part of that, we need to, each in our lives, take those same steps. We must mirror the universe in our own lives to reciprocally create this bend in the universe. For without us, the universe does not exist. And without the universe, we do not exist. And so, however shitty your life is now, however much suffering you're going through now, the only thing that matters is that you take more steps towards the good that you know in your heart tomorrow. That every day is a step towards the promised land, towards the better future that you wish you had. Alright, well, I think this became a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I hope I didn't belabor the point too much, and I hope this was helpful in some way. If anybody has any thoughts, comments, or anything, I truly enjoy reading and seeing other opinions. That's the part of the reason I do this, is to expose myself to new ways of thinking, and it's very important to me, so please let me know. Alright, thank you guys.